In a small, quiet cemetery, a lone mourner watches as the last shovelful of dirt is poured over the grave of a man who died decades ago. But as the soil settles, something catches the mourner's eye movement beneath the surface. Panic sets in as the figure from the coffin, not decomposed, stirs and begins to claw its way out. The grave wasn't empty. He had been buried alive. The wind had not yet died when the last of the mourners turned to leave. The cemetery, a forgotten corner of the world, stood still beneath the weight of the afternoon, as though time had taken its leave here too. Among the trees, the branches swayed with a heavy grace, their rustling a soft murmur to the quiet place where the earth met the sky dot in the distance. A single figure stood alone by the newly dug grave. It was as if the entire world had forgotten that this place had once known life-tender grass now trampled by sorrow. Dark dirt piled high on a wooden casket. The mourner was small, fragile in posture, dressed in a coat too large for their body. They didn't seem to notice the cold or the dampness of the soil that pressed in around them. A locket, worn smooth with time, hung from their neck, reflecting faint, broken light. It caught the wind and swayed slightly, as though it too felt the pull of the grave. There was no sign of grief on their face, only a stillness that whispered of things unsaid. The shovel hit the earth with a finality that felt almost too quiet, another layer of dirt to cover the final breath of a life that had been taken too. Soon the wind picked up, howling through the branches as if it too had something to say, but it was drowned out by a low tremor in the earth. At first, it was subtle, a mere vibration that the mourner almost mistook for their imagination. Then, it came again, stronger this time. The earth beneath the freshly packed dirt rippled, shuddering in quiet distress, as if it were alive and trying to breathe. The mourners straightened, their gaze narrowing as the tremor echoed beneath them. A low, breathless gasp escaped their lips. It was movement. Something or someone was stirring beneath the surface. The tremor became more distinct, the sound now a faint scraping, a desperate, clawing sound, coming from somewhere deep inside the grave. The mourners had all long since left, leaving only the bitter scent of earth and a lingering echo of what was supposed to have been final. The mourner's heart thudded in their chest, not with the panic of a person unprepared, but with the quiet recognition of something too horrifying to bear. They knelt slowly, as though drawn to the tremors, their fingers brushing against the loose dirt. A hand. The shape of it was indistinct at first, half buried, as though it had slipped from the surface of the earth and fallen back into the shadow of the grave. A fingernail, jagged and worn, scraped the dirt in frantic, silent desperation. A tremor ran through the mourners' limbs, their breath catching in the cold air. This was no mere grave disturbance. This was a life, no, a death reaching from beyond the grave. The hand twisted again, and slowly, agonizingly, a figure began to emerge, its body still clinging to the decomposing remains of its casket. Mud splashed as the figure dragged itself free, limbs half-formed, skin still warm with the sickly sheen of life not fully given up. A man, or what had once been a man, clawed his way toward the surface, the agony of his motion silent, yet loud in the mourner's ears. He wasn't dead, not truly. The locket swung from the mourner's neck, catching the glint of dying light, but it was now irrelevant. A memory stirred in the mourner's mind, a whisper long lost to time. He was never supposed to die like this. The figure, grotesque and contorted, let out a faint, ragged breath. It pulled itself from the dirt with a final, desperate motion. And for a moment, the air hung heavy with something too terrifying to name. He had been buried alive. The mourner's heart skipped a beat, the weight of the truth sinking in. It was a grave, yes, but one of lies. This was a tomb not for death, but for a secret too dark to keep. Buried with no one to mourn. The figure's eyes flickered, and the mourner stepped back, almost without thinking, their breath catching in the back of their throat. A tear, silent and unforgiving, slid down their cheek, not for the man who had died, But for the truth now clawing its way to the surface. And then it stopped. The figure collapsed, exhausted, its movement ceased. And for a moment, everything was still frozen in time. But the earth held its own secret, one that would remain locked in the silence of the grave, buried deeper than anyone could understand. Mourner turned away, the weight of the locket heavy against their chest. Their hand trembled as they reached for it, but no words came. The grave was still, silent. Yet, somewhere, something still stirred in the shadows. Who was buried in that grave, really? The house was still, too still. The air had thickened with silence in the hours since the funeral, and the smell of fresh flowers seemed heavy, clinging to the corners of the room. The youngest son sat at his desk, his fingers tracing the rim of a cup untouched, eyes unfocused. The room, his sanctuary, felt different tonight. There was a weight in the air, a pressure he couldn't name, but could feel. He had heard it first when the light had dimmed, a soft murmur that seemed to rise from the direction of the cemetery. It was almost too faint, too far away to be real, yet it tugged at something inside him, a soft pull like an old memory buried. Too deep. The wind? A trick of his mind? Or something else? He stood from his chair and moved toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the expanse of darkness that stretched beyond the yard. The cemetery was faintly visible, a distant smudge against the night sky. The breeze stirred. The branches of the old oak, their rustling a whispered conversation only the trees understood. It came again. A faint sound, like a whisper carried on the wind, so far away, yet not. He couldn't make out the words, but it didn't matter. The unease had set in. He wasn't imagining this. He hesitated, his hand pressing against the glass, the cold of it grounding him in this strange moment. His breath fogged the window. The wind shifted, and the murmur grew louder, stronger, almost urgent. The sound of his father's name, he was sure of it, but why? He needed to know. He couldn't just stay here, not when the wind was carrying something that felt like a message. The night was still too young, too heavy, but the path ahead was clear, drawn in a way he didn't understand. He turned from the window, his fingers brushing against the locket his mother had left behind. A thing he hadn't paid much mind to before, just another piece of memory. But now, it felt more like a weight around his neck, like an anchor, holding him to something that couldn't be forgotten. He grabbed his jacket, the fabric too stiff against his skin, and stepped into the night. The yard was quiet, too quiet. Like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The moon hung low, casting long shadows that made the ground feel unfamiliar, like it wasn't quite his own anymore. He moved toward the back gate, the old metal creaking under his touch, and his shoes left faint impressions in the damp earth. As he crossed the lawn, the cemetery was close now, too close, and yet he couldn't stop. There was a tension that seemed to crackle in the air around him, a hum of something restless that mirrored the coldness in his chest. The graveyard stretched out before him in the dark, its stones sharp against the night sky. The wind tugged at the edges of his coat, and for a moment, he wondered if he might be too late, if whatever had been stirring out here had already stopped. And then he heard it again, a soft scratching sound, far below the surface, a tremor in the earth. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he thought he might turn and run back to the safety of the house. But he couldn't. His feet moved, as if drawn by an invisible hand, until he stood just at the edge of the freshly disturbed grave, his eyes scanning the dirt that had only hours ago been packed down over the body of the man who had been his father. The earth seemed to shift, as though breathing, as though there was something, someone, still trying to rise from it. His eyes locked onto the mound of dirt, the shadow of a figure barely visible beneath the surface, as though something long buried was attempting to claw its way to freedom. The murmur, the whispers, they were louder now, clearer. He could hear them, could feel them, the desperate plea buried beneath the soil. His father's voice? It couldn't be. But there was something else, too. Another sound, hidden in the same rhythm, something more. SOME to HING, darker. His hand trembled, the cold metal of the locket now pressing into his palm, grounding him as he looked down at the grave. His mind raced. Why had they buried him like this? His chest tightened. No one had been told the truth about the death. No one had asked the questions they should have. What had really happened to his father? He swallowed hard, and then, as if the earth itself had answered him, the figure beneath the grave stirred again, shifting violently. The mound of dirt quaked, and for a split second, the night was alive with sound, a loud, strangled gasp from the grave, followed by the sharp sound of something heavy being scraped across the ground. He stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. The wind whipped around him, carrying something more than grief. A distant sob, perhaps. Or the sound of something else, too. Something that had no name. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the small object inside. A piece of evidence he had kept from the others, one they didn't need to know about yet. Not until he knew the truth for himself. The winds carried more than grief. What else was in the air? The house was silent once again. The kind of silence that felt too heavy, too expectant. It clung to the walls, the floorboards, the spaces between each family member, none of them daring to breathe too deeply. The youngest son stood in the living room, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for the pile of papers on the table. He hadn't intended to look through his father's things, but the envelope caught his eye. It wasn't the letter itself that unnerved him, but the weight of it, the way it seemed to pulse in his hands, as if it were waiting for him to open it. The family had been talking in whispers since the funeral, fragments of their lives snapping at the edges, just like the scattered papers on the table. But this letter, sealed and yellowed with age, felt different. It had no return address, no stamp, nothing to tell him where it had come from or when it had been written. His hands were shaking now. The envelope, a raw, unread message from a past they thought was sealed. His heart thudded against his chest, the small thud echoing like a warning. Slowly, he peeled the seal back, his fingers brushing the edges of the paper. A single line of text, scrawled in ink that had faded with time, stared back at him. "You don't know the man you buried." The words didn't make sense, not then, not in the quiet of the room. He sat back, staring at the letter, feeling the pulse of dread crawling up his spine. His eyes flicked to the rest of the family, all still sitting in their chairs, pretending that the air between them wasn't thick with uncertainty. The room felt smaller, the walls inching closer as the words on the paper whispered through his mind. He glanced at the locket his mother had given him earlier that day, the cool metal warm in his palm. It had belonged to his father once. Now it felt like something else entirely, something heavy, like a secret too burdened to carry. He clenched it in his fist. "Is something wrong?" His sister's voice broke through the silence, soft, hesitant. Her gaze shifted from his hands to the letter still lying open on the table. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a tremor running through it. "But we need to talk." The others shifted in their seats, their eyes glancing away. No one wanted to speak the words they all knew were waiting to be said. The youngest son stood abruptly, knocking the chair back with a loud scrape. The scrape felt sharp, unnatural, like a fracture in the stillness. He stepped into the hallway, the sound of his shoes echoing off the wooden floor, heavy like the weight of 100 unspoken truths. As he passed the kitchen door, he caught sight of his mother's old tea set on the counter, the china still chipped in places, the lipstick stain barely visible on one of the cups. The stain that had remained there, untouched for years. It was a reminder of a time before things had shifted, before the secrets had begun to take root. He reached out to touch the cup, his fingers brushing against the fragile china. Everything buried rises again sometimes, in unexpected forms. The thought struck him like a flash, the truth of it sinking deep into his gut. He turned away, his fingers gripping the doorframe as he moved back toward the living room. The letter, his father's secret, was buried beneath layers of history. And now it was all rising, spilling out into the open. The others had gathered around the table now, their faces a blur of confusion and suspicion. His sister, her expression unreadable, finally spoke. "What does it mean? What does it all mean?" He didn't know how to answer her. The letter, the murmurs in the night, none of it made sense. The deeper he searched, the further away the truth seemed. The wind stirred outside, tapping against the window like a warning, a low, insistent sound. The youngest son stood at the edge of the room, the letter still clenched tightly in his hand. He could feel the weight of it pulling at him, dragging him toward something he wasn't sure he was ready for. His gaze flipped to the door, the open window beyond it, and the cemetery that seemed so far away, but now felt closer than ever. He turned back to face them, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I need to go back there." The wind outside howled, as if in agreement. He could feel the weight of his mother's eyes on him, the silent question that hung between them all. What had his father done? What had they missed? The buried truths lay in the soil of the grave, but they were alive, waiting to be unearthed. What secrets were buried with him? He asked, more to himself than to anyone else, the question floating in the air between them all, and somewhere, in the back of his mind, a quiet echo repeated, "If justice still matters, you'll want the next page." The house was darker tonight. The shadows stretched longer, deeper, as if something unseen had settled within the corners. It had been a week since the funeral, but the silence inside felt too thick, too constant. No one spoke much anymore. Not after the letter, not after. The questions had risen and settled like smoke in the room. The daughter sat in the parlor, staring out the window at the stillness of the garden, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Her fingers brushed over the edge of the locket again, feeling the cool metal beneath her skin. It had been her father's, her mother's too, though she didn't remember much about it. She remembered the way her father would stroke it absently when he was deep in thought, as if trying to hold on to something that had slipped through his fingers long ago. The locket was always there, always close, but now it felt like an anchor to a past she had no part in. She let it rest in her palm for a moment, before placing it back around her neck. The house was too quiet, almost suffocating in its stillness. Her mother and brother had retreated into their own corners, each of them carrying some unspoken weight, their eyes avoiding one another as though the distance between them could shield them from the truth. The only sound in the house was the creaking of the old wooden floors beneath her feet. The wind outside shifted, tugging at the edges of the curtains, but it was the soft murmur of a voice she thought she heard that made her freeze. It was faint, far too faint to be real. She strained, holding her breath, but the house remained quiet, save for the whisper of the wind. Was it her mind playing tricks? Or was it something else? She stood from the couch, stepping slowly toward the hallway, her footsteps muffled against the carpet. There it was again, a soft whisper, distant but clear, coming from the direction of her father's study. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The unease had been gnawing at her, quiet at first, and now it bloomed into something almost palpable. She walked down the hall, her heart thudding in her chest, the house closing in around her like a living thing. The whispering grew louder, though she could still make out nothing clear enough to understand. The door to her father's study creaked open on its own, an unsettling sound that seemed too deliberate. She stepped inside. The room was exactly as it had been the day before, the same books, the same heavy oak desk with the same leather chair. Yet something felt off. The air was colder here, the shadows deeper, and the corners of the room seemed to stretch in ways that made her pulse quicken. Her eyes swept over the room, but it was the chair at the desk that caught her attention. She hadn't thought to notice it before, but now it was as if it were waiting for her. A sudden, inexplicable memory flashed a moment she couldn't quite place but felt she should have known. Her father, his hands never still, his eyes locked on something only he could see. She stepped closer to the desk, the wood worn and polished from years of use. As her fingers brushed the surface, a faint sound, a scratching noise, like nails against paper, echoed in the room. She froze, looking down at the desk, her breath caught in her throat. A drawer, slightly ajar. Her hands trembled as she pulled it open. There, inside, was something that hadn't been there before. A small, folded piece of paper. She had never seen it in this room, never noticed it during the countless times she had walked through the house. The paper felt oddly warm as she held it, almost alive in her hands. She unfolded it slowly, her gaze scanning the cryptic writing that sprawled across the page. Her heart pounded as the words bled into each other, the message impossible to decipher at first. But then, a name she had never heard before. A tremor ran through her as the truth began to piece itself together. Her father had never truly been the man she thought he was. There were things, dark things, hidden beneath the surface of their lives. Secrets that had been buried just like his body, and now they were rising again, creeping through the walls of their home. The whispering returned then, louder, more insistent. A voice, clear now, but distant. It was her father's voice or something like it. She couldn't be sure. It seemed to wrap around her, urging her to listen, to understand. The house was no longer a home. It was a place of confinement, its walls closing in on her, the air thick with the secrets it held. She turned from the desk, her pulse racing, and caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye movement. Flickering in the hallway, her father's shadow. She was frozen. It wasn't possible, she knew that. But there, at the edge of her vision, the shadow loomed, watching her with eyes she couldn't see, a presence that filled the space between the living and the dead. Her hand flew to her mouth as her breath caught. The grave had never truly been close. The whispering stopped. Everything was still again, so still it hurt. And in that stillness she knew something had been left behind. Something had never been buried. Who or what is still haunting the family? The morning was overcast, the sky pressing down like a weight too heavy for the earth. The family gathered in the kitchen, all of them moving in silence, their eyes avoiding one another's, like strangers who had been forced into proximity. The youngest son stood by the window, his hands clenched around the edges of the glass, his reflection faint but distorted, just as the truth had been in the past few days. It was all too much. The letter, the whispers, the grave, it had been too much to take in, and now they were standing on the precipice, the ground beneath them shifting with each passing second. The shovel in his hand felt strange. It wasn't his father's grave that had been dug up. It was the foundation of everything they thought they knew. He looked over his shoulder. His mother was seated at the table, her fingers circling the rim of a cup, the motion slow and deliberate, as if trying to soothe a wound that could never be healed. Her face was a mask, but her eyes, their deep-set shadows, told the story of a woman who had lived too many years beneath the weight of lies. His sister stood at the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. There was no room for comfort now. No words left to say. They were here for one reason only, to find out what had really been buried in the earth. The youngest son stepped toward the door, the weight of the shovel pulling at his side, dragging him into the unknown. He couldn't shake the image of the grave, of the whisper that had carried on the wind, beckoning him to return. Something had been wrong from the start. He knew it now. They all did. But none of them had the courage to face the truth until the earth had demanded it. He stood by the grave, the hole wide and raw in the morning light, the edges of the disturbed earth jagged and uneven. His mother's eyes were fixed on the casket as the men worked to remove the lid, her lips trembling with something unsaid. His sister stood beside her, her arms still crossed, her gaze distant, but not in the way it used to be. It wasn't disbelief anymore. It was something else, fear. The lid creaked as it was lifted, the sound hollow and unnatural. The youngest son could feel the cold air rush in, carrying with it the scent of dirt and decay, mingling with the faint smell of something older, something buried long before his father had been laid to rest. When the casket was fully exposed, the truth was there, staring them in the face, too grotesque to deny. The body was wrong. It wasn't his father. The youngest son's breath caught in his throat. The shock hit him like a physical blow. His mother's hands trembled, and his sister made a sound, a low, almost inaudible gasp, as she stepped back, her face as pale as the grave itself. They had buried the wrong man. The air seemed to stop moving for a moment. It was as if time had stretched into infinity, leaving them there, staring at the body that wasn't theirs. The youngest son's heart pounded, a relentless thumping that drowned out the world. His hands were slick with sweat, and his fingers twitched against the shovel's handle. Who? His mother's voice broke the silence, her words slipping into the void between them. She reached out a trembling hand, but no one dared answer. They couldn't. There was no name for the horror that stood before them. There was only the lie. They had buried a stranger. But who was he? The youngest son took a step back, his legs unsteady beneath him. The truth was unraveling too quickly, too violently. How had they not seen it before? How had they let it go on for so long? His eyes shifted to the tombstone, the name carved into it. His father's name, but it was just a name. A name that meant nothing now. His mother fell to her knees, the weight of it too much to bear. She reached for the body, her fingers brushing against the unfamiliar skin of the man who had been buried in her husband's place. A tear slid down her cheek, though no one could say whether it was for the man in the grave, or for the life they'd lost to the lies. The youngest son moved toward her, but stopped. He couldn't comfort her, not now. The locket pressed into his chest, a quiet reminder of all that had been lost, all that had been kept hidden in the shadows. The thing that had been buried beneath his father's name. A wind stirred, colder than before, sweeping across the graveyard. It carried with it the faintest whisper, almost lost in the rustling of the leaves. He could hear it again, the voice that had haunted him since the day of the funeral, faint and fragile, like a memory long forgotten. The body was wrong, yes, but it wasn't just the body. It was everything. If he wasn't in the grave, the youngest son whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief, then where is he now? And as the words left his lips, the wind grew stronger, louder, almost like a warning. The house was unnervingly still, its silence thicker than it had been the night before. Each room, each corner, seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The youngest son sat alone in the parlor, his hands clenched around the locket he hadn't noticed before today, its cool metal sharp against his palm. He stared at the old photograph on the mantel, the one of his father standing tall, the very image of the man who had raised him, who had loved him. Or so he thought. A whisper of air slipped in through the cracks of the closed window, carrying with it the smell of the earth, of things buried far deeper than the family could comprehend. His mother and sister were in the kitchen, though the distance between them was palpable. They hadn't spoken in hours. The words between them had all been said, and the air between them was filled with the remnants of what they knew but couldn't yet face. The letter, the grave, the lies. Everything had changed. He didn't know when it had started, or when he'd stopped being a child in this house. But today, in the quiet aftermath of the truth, he felt older, wiser, in a way, and yet more lost than ever. The locket in his hand felt like a weight. He remembered his father wearing it, fingers grazing over the edges like a prayer. A piece of the past. A thread that led them here, to this moment. It wasn't just the body in the grave. It was everything. His father's voice, his touch, his presence, it was all hollow now. And the gaping hole in the center of it was the truth they'd never known. His sister's voice broke through the thick silence, muffled from the other room. You knew, didn't you? You knew all along. The words hit him like a physical blow. He stood up too quickly, the chair scraping sharply against the floor. He felt his heart in his throat, but he said nothing, nothing at all. His mother's soft cry echoed through the house, and then silence again. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the edge of the torn receipt, the one he'd found buried in his father's desk drawer. He hadn't spoken of it yet, had kept it hidden, but it burned in his pocket, sharp and real. The transaction was printed clearly across the paper, the date written in black ink. His father's signature, too. He'd signed off on something that should never have been touched. With the receipt now in hand, he felt a surge of urgency. The truth was slipping away, and the weight of the family's betrayal was becoming unbearable. He stepped out into the hallway, the cold walls of the house closing in on him. He could hear the faint rustling of his sister moving in the kitchen, but he didn't go to her. He couldn't face her yet, not with the receipt burning a hole in his hand. The house creaked as he moved down the narrow hall. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the very walls were pressing against him, closing in, suffocating him with the weight of everything that had been hidden. The shadows seemed to stretch, reaching for him, as if the house itself was alive, waiting for him to acknowledge the ghosts it held. He reached his father's study, the room that had always felt off limits, always heavy with memories he never dared to probe. The door was slightly ajar, and the familiar scent of old books and leather wrapped around him as he stepped inside. The desk was just as it had been, papers scattered across it, the faint imprint of his father's presence still lingering in the air. But there, on the corner of the desk, was something he hadn't seen before, a small silver key, his father's key, the one he always kept in his pocket. It gleamed in the dim light, untouched, but alive in its own way. He reached for it, his fingers cold against the cool metal, and as he did, a whisper passed through the room, soft and insistent, like the breath of the past speaking its final words. He took the key and turned, walking back down the hall, the weight of it in his pocket more real than the silence surrounding him. He couldn't stop now. Not when the final piece was so close. He had to know. His mother's voice called from the kitchen again, the words muffled, but this time they were sharper, more direct. "Why are you doing this?" The youngest son stopped, his heart hammering. He couldn't answer her, not yet. He wasn't sure he had the words. Instead, he pressed the key into his palm, the sharp edge digging into his skin. The truth had been buried beneath layers of lies, hidden in the soil of their family history. But the key, it was the key to everything. He could feel it. The house, the family, they were all built on something that wasn't real, something that had never been real. He reached the basement door, his fingers trembling as he slid the key into the lock. The click echoed, a final sound before everything changed. The door creaked open, and there, in the dim light, he saw it. The box, his father's box, the one that had never been touched, the one that had always been locked away, kept from sight. He pulled the box from the shelf, his hands shaking as he opened it. Inside were the photographs, faces he didn't recognize, a series of names scribbled on the back. The truth was there, hidden in plain sight, his father's secret life, the lies that had been buried with him. He turned the photographs over, the names blurring before his eyes, and a chill ran down his spine. He couldn't look away, and then he saw it. The letter, sealed in an envelope. The words, written in ink that had long since faded, but the message was clear. The letter wasn't just for him. It was for everyone. Revenge is a dish best served cold and buried deep. He closed his eyes, the weight of it all crashing over him. Who will survive the unraveling of the family's darkest secret? The house was quiet. So quiet that every breath seemed too loud, every step too heavy. The youngest son stood in the center of the living room, the faint glow of the afternoon sun creeping through the blinds, casting shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. His mother and sister sat at the table, their faces drawn and tired, as if the weight of their shared history had finally come crashing down. leaving nothing but empty spaces where their voices used to be. The locket in his hand felt colder now than it ever had before. He turned it over and over, his fingers tracing the edges, the metal warm with the weight of the years, the memories it held. It had always been a symbol of family, of love, of continuity. But now it felt like a relic, something that no longer held the truth. He glanced at his mother, her gaze fixed on the table, hands folded neatly in front of her. Her eyes, red from too many sleepless nights, never once met his. She hadn't said a word since the truth came out, and neither had his sister. They were waiting, as if somehow the past could still be undone. But he knew better now. The truth was already here. It was not going anywhere. The youngest son stepped toward the window, looking out at the yard where the trees were heavy with the weight of the past. The house felt smaller now, too close. There was no room left for secrets here, no place to hide. He turned back to face them, the locket slipping from his fingers and resting against his chest. He didn't need to say it. They all knew. Everything that had been buried, every lie that had been whispered in the dark, was now out in the open. And nothing would ever be the same. His mother shifted, her voice barely a whisper. What happens now? He didn't know how to answer her. The words felt too heavy to speak. Instead, he pulled the torn receipt from his pocket, the one he had found weeks ago, its edges crinkled and torn, its meaning clearer than ever. He didn't need to show it to them. They'd already seen the evidence, already felt the weight of it. But he needed them to see it again. His mother's eyes flickered to it, then quickly away. But his sister's gaze held steady. She had never been the one to hide, never been the one to look away. But even she didn't speak. The youngest son exhaled slowly, the truth sinking in deeper than it ever had before. The past had its claws in them all, and no matter how hard they tried to dig their way out, it would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface. We can't undo it, he said, his voice low yet steady. But we can choose what comes next. His sister's eyes widened slightly. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. She hadn't expected him to say that. She hadn't expected him to speak at all. Their mother finally raised her eyes, but they were empty, haunted by something that could never be erased. What do we do with this? She asked, her voice trembling. The youngest son didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned, walking toward the door. The sound of his footsteps on the wooden floor was sharp in the silence. He reached for the door handle, his fingers brushing against the cool metal. And then, for a moment, everything was still. The house, the truth, the family. Everything seemed frozen, suspended in the space between past and present. The youngest son's hand hovered over the door, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to feel the weight of it all. I don't know, he finally said, his voice quiet, but I won't let it destroy us. Not anymore. His mother didn't reply, but the smallest shift in her posture told him everything he needed to know. She had heard him. She had finally understood. The youngest son opened the door, the cool breeze rushing in, filling the space with something new, something unknown. The world outside still turned, still moved forward. But in here, in this house, the past would always be present. And that was something they would have to learn to live with. He stepped outside, the wind tugging at his hair, pulling him towards something beyond the walls of the house, something that would take him far away from the secrets they had all carried. For so long. As he walked into the yard, his mother's voice echoed softly in his mind. What happens now? The wind carried her words with it, as if answering her question. The silence that followed spoke louder than any answer could. When the truth is exposed, who will be left to heal? The air was thick with the weight of everything that had been said, and all that remained unsaid. The cemetery stood silent in the early morning light, its stones etched with stories that no one dared to speak aloud. The youngest son stood at the edge of the grave, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat, the chill of the morning. Air creeping through the fabric. The earth, still disturbed from the last time they stood here, seemed to hold its breath with him. The locket, heavy against his chest, pressed into his skin as he watched the ground before him. His fingers traced its edges absently, as though it were a lifeline, something to hold on to in this moment. The truth had been exposed, the lies revealed. And now, here he was again, standing over the same grave, about to bury it all. The past. The lies, the hurt, everything that had lived beneath the surface for years had come to a head. And in this moment, with the locket warming against his chest, it seemed that only the silence between them could hold the weight of what had been. Lost dot behind him, his mother and sister stood, their figures blurred in the periphery. They had said little since the revelation. His mother, her face drawn in tight, clutched something in her hand, her own locket, worn smooth with time. She hadn't worn it since the day his father had been buried. But today, it seemed to have found its place again. The youngest son didn't. Look back at them. He didn't need to. Their presence was enough. The family had unraveled, piece by piece, and now they were here, waiting for something. Waiting for closure, or perhaps just the quiet to settle over them again. He kneeled at the edge of the grave, his hand resting on the shovel's handle. The earth before him, freshly turned, seemed to tremble slightly as though it held a secret. Something buried too deep to be easily uncovered. His fingers clenched around the handle, his knuckles white with the pressure. The weight of it was heavier than he had imagined. The grief, the anger, the disbelief, they all seemed to swirl together. In this moment, he had spent years looking for answers, searching for something that made sense. But now, as he stood there, he realized that it had never been about finding the truth at all. It was about learning to live with it. The sun broke through the clouds. Then, casting a pale light across the grave. It was the same light they had stood under that day, the day they had buried his father. The day the lies had taken root and the truth had been hidden beneath the earth, just like everything else. Youngest son swallowed hard, the taste of bitterness rising in his throat. He wasn't sure if it was the truth he was burying or the future they had all been so desperate to hold on to. The future they had imagined for themselves, based on a lie. His hands trembled as he picked up the first shovel full of dirt, tossing it over the casket with slow, deliberate movements. The sound of the earth hitting the lid echoed in the stillness. It was a hollow sound, like the finality of something that could never be undone. As he continued to shovel the dirt, his thoughts drifted, like fragments of a memory he could barely grasp. He remembered his father's voice, soft and warm, calling him in from the yard when he was a child. He remembered the way his mother had looked at him when he had first asked about the locket. The same way she had looked at him today. The shadows of the past lingered, their shapes stretching long over the grave. He could hear his father's voice again, faint but clear. Some graves are for bodies, others are for souls. He paused, the shovel suspended in midair. His father's words echoed in his mind, a message from the past that he had never fully understood until now. Some graves, the ones that hurt the most, weren't just for the bodies of the dead. They were for the souls that remained, buried deep in the soil of their lives, hidden under layers of time and memory. The youngest son let the shovel fall back to the ground, his chest tight with the weight of it all. He stood there, staring down at the grave, at the place where everything they had been was buried. Where everything they could have been was buried too. His mother's soft cry broke the silence then. The youngest son didn't turn to her, but he felt the weight of her grief pressing against him. He didn't know if it was the grief of losing his father, or the grief of losing what they had once believed to be true. His sister stepped forward then, her face pale but resolute. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Instead, she knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She didn't pull away when he flinched. Instead, she stayed, her touch grounding him, reminding him that they were still here, that they still had each other. The youngest son let out a long, shaky breath, the weight of it all finally settling into his bones. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time he felt as though the past had been laid to rest. Not in the grave, but in the space between them. In the silence, he stepped back from the grave, his heart heavy but strangely light at the same time. The world around him seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something, waiting for forgiveness, or perhaps redemption. The last shovel full of dirt hit the ground with a soft thud. And for a moment, everything was still. When the truth is exposed, who will be left to heal? The sunlight filtered through the trees, the light soft, almost forgiving, as it brushed the edges of the house. It had been a year since that day, the day they had unearthed everything they had buried for so long. A year of quiet healing, of piecing together what had once been shattered. The youngest son stood in the yard, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat, watching the sun rise higher, the warmth of the morning crawling into his bones. The house, once dark with secrets, seemed to breathe in the light now. It wasn't perfect, not by any means, but it was different. They were different. His mother was inside, somewhere, her footsteps quiet on the floorboards. She had stopped wearing the locket for a while, but now he'd noticed it again, nestled against her chest, just like before. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, a subtle sign that things were changing, that healing had begun. She hadn't spoken of it, but there were moments when she would press it against her heart, as if the weight of it gave her strength. His sister had found her voice again too. She was distant, quieter than before, but the silence no longer held the same sharpness. They no longer stood on opposite sides of some invisible chasm. Their shared grief had drawn them together, stitching the broken pieces back in a way they hadn't thought possible. The youngest son stepped away from the window, moving to the back porch where his sister sat, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. The smell of it lingered in the air, earthy and warm, like something that could bring comfort even in the quietest moments. She didn't look up as he approached, but her fingers tightened around the cup. She had always been the stronger one, the one with the sharp words and the guarded heart. But now there was something softer in her gaze, a crack in the armor that had always kept her distant. "Is it time?" she asked, her voice low but steady. He nodded, and without a word, she set the cup down and stood. They didn't need to speak about it. They both knew why they were here, why this moment mattered. There were no more lies left to unravel, no more secrets to expose. What had been buried in the past was no longer theirs to carry. They walked to the garden, where the earth had been freshly turned, the soil soft beneath their feet. The youngest son knelt, his hands trembling as he reached for the small shovel. Beside him, the locket, heavy in his chest, reminded him of what they had lost, what they had finally gained back. It was both an anchor and a weight. His father's presence, though absent, still lingered like a ghost. He began to dig, the shovel sinking into the earth with each deliberate motion. His sister stood behind him, her gaze steady, her presence a quiet support. He could feel her eyes on him, could feel the years of silence between them, but now there was a new understanding. They had both been lost, each in their own way, and now they were finding their way back to each other. As the hole grew deeper, the memories flooded back. He remembered his father's hands, the way they had held him close as a child, the way his voice had always been so certain, so sure. But it had been a lie, all of it. The life he had known had been built on a foundation of secrets, and the truth had come crashing down when they least expected it. But now in the quiet of the morning, he realized something. The past couldn't be changed. It had been written in the soil, in the air, in every corner of the house that still creaked when no one was looking. But there was something else, something that wasn't buried. The chance to move forward, to rebuild, was here. And it was theirs to take. He stepped back from the hole, wiping his hands on his pants. He had done what he needed to do. The earth, once disturbed, now settled beneath him, as if it had finally found its peace. He looked up at his sister, who was watching him with eyes that seemed to see everything, and yet nothing at all. She stepped forward, her hand outstretched, a silent offer to help him finish what had been started. They both knelt together at the edge of the grave, the final chapter of their father's life resting in the soil before them. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic farewell. There was only the quiet of the morning, the soft sound of earth being moved. The youngest son took the locket in his hand again, the symbol of a life that had been buried too long. He pressed it into the earth, letting the soil swallow it whole, as if to say that the past was finally gone, that what was left was theirs to shape. When the final shovelful of dirt was placed over the grave, there was a moment of silence. A moment that felt like everything had been said and nothing at all. The youngest son stood, his hands shaking, and took a step back. His mother and sister joined him, their faces soft with something unspoken. They weren't healed, not yet. But they had taken the first step toward something new, something that had been waiting for them all along. The sun, now high in the sky, bathed them all in its light, as though the world had decided to let them breathe again. The youngest son looked down at the freshly turned earth, at the place where everything had ended, and he wondered, for a moment, if they could ever truly be free of the past. What's left when the last secret is buried? The cemetery was unchanged, as cemeteries often are. The stone monuments stood like silent sentinels, weathered by time but unyielding to it. The youngest son, now a man, or so it seemed, stood at the gates, looking in, though his feet didn't move. His body had carried him here, but his mind lingered far beyond, in the spaces where memories of his father still hung like ghosts in the corners of the house. 10 years had passed, yet the echoes of that day when the grave had been unearthed, the truth exposed, still reverberated within him. They had never fully left. He hadn't known then that healing wasn't something you did to erase the past. It was something you carried forward with you, like a scar. It wasn't about fixing it. It was about learning how to walk with it, how to bear its weight without breaking. He pulled the locket from his pocket, its metal worn smooth, the edges soft with years of wear. He had not worn it for a long time, yet today it felt like the only thing that anchored him to this place, to the man who had once worn it, the father who had betrayed them all with silence, with lies, and whose absence had come to mean more than his presence ever had. As he walked toward the grave, the wind tugged at his coat, and for a moment, he could almost hear the soft whispers of the past, the voices of the people who had once stood here beside him, his mother, his sister, all of them different, changed by what they had learned, by what they had lost. But there was something he had gained in the years since, something that had taken root in the darkest parts of him, something that had slowly begun to bloom. He knelt by the grave, the soil beneath his hands cool and soft, familiar yet foreign. This was the place where everything had ended, and yet it was the place where the future began. He didn't know what had happened to the man buried here. He didn't know what had happened to the past that had shaped them all. But he knew this. The family he had once known was no more. The family he would build from here, from this moment, would be something new, something that would rise from the ashes of everything they had been. His fingers trembled as he placed the locket on the grave, letting it rest there, the small piece of metal, a symbol of everything that had been lost and everything that had been reclaimed. He pressed his palm to the earth, as if grounding himself to this place, to the moment. The weight of it was heavy. It always would be. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows over the graveyard. The silence between them felt different, not as heavy as it had been before, but still full of things unsaid. Things that had been buried too deep to be easily exhumed. He stood slowly, his body aching with the weight of years, the weight of what he had seen, what he had learned. He turned away from the grave, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement. His eyes flicked to the distance. where the path through the cemetery led back to the house, back to the life he had known, and the life he was now beginning to build. The house no longer felt like a prison, though its walls still whispered of things long past. He had learned to live with the weight of them. His mother's face flashed in his mind, her quiet grief still lingering, still settling into the corners of their home. And his sister, her silence, her distance, her quiet determination. They had all been changed, but they had survived. The youngest son, now a man, looked back once more at the grave, at the final resting place of the man he had once called father, the man who had been both absent and present in ways he couldn't fully understand. There would be no more questions, no more searching for answers that would never come. He exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest lightening just a little. He could feel the past beginning to loosen its grip on him, just enough for him to breathe again. The wind rustled the trees, and for a moment, it almost sounded like a whisper. He didn't look back again. What echoes of the past still remain, and what will be remembered?